For 51 years, investigators believed she was dead. They searched fields, drained ponds, followed leads that stretched from Texas to California and back again. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, chased down thousands of tips, and came up empty every single time. But in 2022, when detectives finally knocked on the right door, they discovered something that defied every assumption they'd ever made about this case. The missing girl, now a woman in her 50s, wasn't buried in some unmarked grave. She wasn't living under an assumed identity in a foreign country. She hadn't been trafficked or hidden away in some underground network. No, she'd been right there all along, living her life, raising her own family, going to work every day, completely unaware that the woman who tucked her in at night, who packed her school lunches, who called herself Mom, had stolen her. Before we unravel how one of the longest-running cold cases in American history was finally cracked, do me a favor, tap that like button. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe to Easy Case so you never miss a breakthrough in the world's coldest cases. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a kidnapping, it's a story about trust, deception, and the terrifying ease with which a stranger can walk into your life, take everything you love, and disappear without a trace. Let's go back to where it all began. Fort Worth, Texas, summer of 1971. The heat that August was relentless. In the working-class neighborhoods of Fort Worth, air conditioning was a luxury most families couldn't afford. Windows stayed open day and night, box fans rattling in doorways, trying to push the thick, humid air through cramped apartments. Kids played in the spray of fire hydrants. Adults sat on porches with cold beers, waiting for the sun to go down and the temperature to drop even just a little. Among those families was 22-year-old Alta Apantenko. She was young, exhausted, and doing everything she could to keep her head above water. Alta worked double shifts as a waitress at a local diner, the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, the tips were never enough, and the customers expected you to smile no matter how tired you were. She had a daughter, Melissa, 21 months old, big brown eyes, chubby cheeks, and a laugh that could light up a room. Alta loved that little girl more than anything in the world. But love doesn't pay the rent. Alta had recently separated from Melissa's father, Jeffrey Highmith. It wasn't a bitter split, just two people who realized they couldn't make it work. Jeffrey was around, but not consistently. And Alta's family? They were states away. No parents nearby to help with babysitting, no siblings to lean on when things got tough. So Alta did what millions of single mothers have done throughout history. She figured it out on her own. She shared a small apartment with a roommate to split the bills. She picked up every extra shift the diner would give her. She stretched every dollar as far as it would go. And when it came to childcare, she did what she had to do. She placed an ad in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, seeking reliable babysitter for weekday care. Toddler, 21 months. Weekdays only. Reasonable rates. It was a routine request, the kind of ad you'd see dozens of times in any newspaper back then. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise red flags. Just a mother trying to find someone trustworthy to watch her daughter while she worked. If you were a parent in 1971 without family nearby, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. Alta waited, and a few days later, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, professional. "Hi, my name is Ruth Johnson. I saw your ad in the paper." Alta felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone responding. Ruth explained that she had years of experience caring for children. She described her home a nice place with a big yard where Melissa could play safely. She spoke with confidence, the kind of tone that put people at ease. She sounded trustworthy. They arranged to meet in person. Ruth said she'd come by the diner where Alta worked so they could talk face to face, go over the details, make sure it was a good fit. But the day of the meeting came and went. Ruth didn't show up. Alta felt that familiar sinking feeling, the disappointment of thinking you found a solution, only to have it fall through. But then, later that evening, the phone rang again. It was Ruth. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice apologetic. "Something came up at the last minute, a family emergency, but I'm still very interested in the position. I promise I'm reliable." Alta hesitated. She wanted to meet this woman in person. She wanted to see her face, shake her hand, get a sense of who she was. But Ruth sounded sincere, and Alta was running out of time. Her work schedule was tightening, she had bills piling up, she needed help, and she needed it now. So, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She hired Ruth Johnson over the phone, sight unseen. At the time, it seemed practical, reasonable, even. People did it all the time back then. You trusted a voice, you trusted a recommendation, you trusted that most people were good, but Ruth Johnson wasn't most people, and Alta was about to learn that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. The morning of August 23rd, 1971, started like any other. Alta woke up early, got dressed for her shift, and kissed Melissa goodbye. The plan was simple. Alta's roommate would stay home with Melissa until the babysitter arrived mid-morning. Then the roommate would hand Melissa off to Ruth, and everything would be fine. Alta left for work around 7:30. The diner was already buzzing with the breakfast crowd: truckers, construction workers, retirees nursing cups of coffee and reading the morning paper. Alta tied on her apron, grabbed her order pad, and got to work. Back at the apartment, the roommate was getting Melissa ready. A fresh diaper, a clean outfit, a bottle packed in a small bag, along with a change of clothes and a few toys. Around 9 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. The roommate opened it. Standing on the other side was a woman, well-dressed, composed. She introduced herself as Ruth Johnson, but something about her was off. It was over 100 degrees outside, the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer and turned car interiors into ovens, the kind of heat where you wore as little as possible just to survive. But this woman? She was covered head to toe, long white gloves that ran all the way up her forearms, a scarf tied snugly around her neck, a large bonnet that shaded most of her face and hid her hair completely. Her outfit looked formal, almost ceremonial, like she was dressed for a Sunday church service, not a morning of babysitting. The roommate found it strange. Who wears layers and gloves in August? But the woman's demeanor was calm, friendly, even. She smiled. She spoke kindly. She seemed completely at ease despite the heavy clothing, and Alta had already made the arrangements. The roommate didn't want to second-guess her friend's decision, so she handed Melissa over. The woman took the toddler gently, settling her on one hip. She accepted the diaper bag with a polite thank you. She adjusted the bonnet on her head, smiled one more time, and turned to leave. The exchange took less than 5 minutes. The roommate watched as the woman walked down the sidewalk, carrying Melissa in her arms. She turned a corner, and then she was gone. That was the last time anyone from Melissa's family saw her. Alta finished her shift that afternoon and headed home, tired but looking forward to seeing her daughter. She walked into the apartment expecting to hear Melissa's voice, maybe see her playing with toys on the floor or napping in her crib. Instead, she walked into silence. Melissa wasn't there. Her crib was empty, her toys untouched. The bottle Alta had prepared that morning sat full on the counter. At first, Alta thought maybe the babysitter had taken Melissa out for a walk. Maybe they were at a park nearby. Maybe Ruth had mentioned something to the roommate and there'd been a miscommunication. But as the minutes ticked by, that hopeful assumption began to crack. Alta asked her roommate, "Where's Melissa?" "The babysitter picked her up this morning, around 9. "And she hasn't brought her back?" "No. I thought she was supposed to keep her all day." Alta's chest tightened. She tried calling the number Ruth had given her. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. She asked neighbors in the complex if they'd seen a woman with a small child. No one had. By the time the sun started to set, hope had turned to dread. And by nightfall, dread had turned to panic. At 8 o'clock that evening, Alta picked up the phone and dialed the Fort Worth Police Department. "My daughter is missing." Officers arrived within the hour. They took statements from Alta and her roommate, writing down every detail they could remember. The description of the babysitter stood out immediately. A woman dressed in long gloves, a scarf, and a bonnet. In 100-degree heat, the officers exchanged glances. This wasn't eccentric fashion. This was a disguise. They ran the name Ruth Johnson through local records. Nothing. No one by that name matched the description. No address, no phone number that could be traced. The roommate's account became the only lead they had. A polite, soft-spoken woman who'd gone to great lengths to conceal her identity. The gloves could have been worn to avoid leaving fingerprints. The bonnet and scarf hid her hair, her face, any distinguishing features. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned, calculated, executed with precision. And whoever this woman was, she'd just walked away with a 21-month-old child and vanished into thin air. That night, Fort Worth police launched a full-scale investigation. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, showing Melissa's photograph, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that morning. Not a single person remembered seeing a woman carrying a toddler. Detectives visited nearby shops, restaurants, bus stations. They checked with taxi companies and transit authorities. They alerted hospitals and clinics across the region in case someone brought in a child matching Melissa's description. Nothing. They searched vacant lots, wooded areas, alleys near the freeway, anywhere a child's belongings might have been discarded. Still nothing. It was as if Melissa and the woman in white gloves had simply evaporated. By the second day, the FBI stepped in. They classified the case as a likely kidnapping under the Federal Kidnapping Act, which gave them jurisdiction if there was any chance Melissa had been taken across state lines. Wanted posters went up across Texas and into neighboring states. Newspapers ran the story. Television stations broadcast Alta's tearful plea for her daughter's safe return. But despite the media coverage, despite the search parties, despite the hundreds of man-hours poured into the investigation, there were no leads. This was 1971. No surveillance cameras, no internet, no cell phones, no credit card trails to follow. The mysterious babysitter had arranged everything through untraceable phone calls, likely made from payphones scattered across the city. Every investigative tool available at the time relied on human memory and physical evidence, and there was none. The case went cold almost immediately. Within weeks, the active search was scaled back. Melissa's file was transferred to the Missing Persons Bureau, joining dozens of other unsolved cases in a metal cabinet, waiting for the day when someone might come forward with new information. But that day never came. Not in 1971, not in 1972, not in the years that followed. Alta's life became a living nightmare. She quit her job to focus entirely on finding Melissa. She spent her days at police headquarters, answering the same questions over and over, hoping that maybe this time some new detail would emerge. At night, she lay awake replaying every moment. The classified ad, the phone calls, the decision to hire Ruth without meeting her in person. What if she'd insisted on an in-person interview? What if she'd asked more questions? What if she'd been more careful? The what-ifs were endless, and they were unbearable. As the months turned into years, the media moved on. Melissa's photograph faded from front pages. The story that had once dominated local news became a footnote, then a memory, then a ghost. But for Alta, Jeffrey, and everyone who loved Melissa, the pain never faded. They lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn because they didn't know if Melissa was dead, unable to hope because they had no reason to believe she was alive. And the woman in white gloves? She was gone, completely, as if she'd never existed at all. By the end of 1971, Melissa Highmith's name had been added to a growing list of missing children in America. Her case stood out for one reason above all others. There were no clues, no evidence, no witnesses, just a mother's trust, betrayed in the cruelest way imaginable, and a single, haunting image that would never leave Alta's mind. A woman in white gloves, walking away with her daughter, disappearing around a corner, and taking everything with her. So here's the question I want you to think about. If someone you trusted, someone who seemed kind, professional, and completely normal, turned out to be a monster in disguise, how would you ever trust anyone again? How do you move forward when the person who destroyed your life is a ghost you can't even name? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to see how this impossible case was finally solved after 51 years, make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Desk, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The years that followed were a special kind of torture, not the kind where you know the ending and can begin to heal, not the kind where closure, however painful, allows you to move forward. No, this was the torture of not knowing, of waking up every single morning for 51 years, wondering if today would be the day the phone would ring, the day a detective would knock on the door with news, good or bad, that would finally end the waiting. But that day never came. At least, not for a very long time. Because while Alta Apantenko spent decades searching for her daughter, Melissa was out there, living, breathing, growing up, completely unaware that the life she was living was built on a lie. And the woman who took her, she was living her life too, raising Melissa as her own, going to PTA meetings, celebrating birthdays, playing the role of mother so convincingly that no one, not neighbors, not teachers, not even Melissa herself, ever suspected a thing. For 51 years, the truth stayed buried. But here's what you need to understand about the truth. It doesn't stay buried forever. By the time 1972 rolled around, the Fort Worth Police Department had officially run out of leads. Every tip that came in, and there were dozens in those first few months, led nowhere. A woman matching the description was spotted in Oklahoma, turned out to be a dead end. Someone called in saying they saw a toddler who looked like Melissa at a grocery store in Louisiana. Investigators followed up. It wasn't her. Each false lead was a knife in Alta's chest. She'd get the call. Her heart would race. Hope would flood back in, just for a moment, and then the detective would deliver the news. It wasn't her. I'm sorry. How many times can a person hear those words before hope turns to despair? Alta found out. The investigation into Melissa's disappearance had been thorough, but it was also limited by the technology of the time. Detectives did everything they could with the tools they had. They interviewed hundreds of people. They checked adoption records, hospital admissions, school enrollments, across multiple states. But without a suspect name, without a single piece of physical evidence, without even a clear photograph of the woman who took Melissa, they were chasing shadows. By mid-1972, the case was officially classified as cold. That didn't mean it was closed. It just meant there was nothing left to investigate. No active leads, no new information, just a file in a cabinet and a family left to wonder. Alta tried to move on. She really did. She went back to work eventually, though the diner felt different now. Everything felt different. She'd be taking an order, smiling at a customer, pouring coffee, and suddenly she'd see a little girl with brown hair walk by outside the window, and her breath would catch in her throat. Is that her? It never was. Jeffrey, Melissa's father, struggled in his own way. He and Alta weren't together anymore, but they were bound by this shared grief. They'd call each other on Melissa's birthday every year. They'd sit in silence on the other end of the line, both thinking the same thing. How old would she be now? What would she look like? Is she even alive? The not knowing was its own kind of death. And here's the thing about cold cases in the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds. They stayed cold. There was no DNA database to check. No national fingerprint registry that could be accessed with the click of a button. No internet to crowdsource information or spread awareness. If a case went cold, it stayed cold unless someone came forward with new information, and no one did. The 1,980 seconds brought a new wave of awareness about missing children. You started seeing their faces on milk cartons, on posters in post offices, in public service announcements on TV. Melissa's face was among them. But even with the increased visibility, nothing changed. The leads didn't come, the tips dried up, and the Highmith family was left in the same agonizing limbo they'd been in since 1971. Alta had more children in the years that followed. So did Jeffrey. They each remarried, started new families, tried to build lives that weren't defined entirely by loss. But Melissa was always there. Her absence was a presence in every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone. Melissa's younger siblings grew up knowing they had a sister they'd never met, a sister who'd been stolen before they were even born. They saw the pain in their mother's eyes whenever August 23rd came around. They learned not to ask too many questions because the answers were too painful. Imagine that for a second. Imagine growing up in the shadow of a sibling who vanished. Imagine knowing that your mother's heart has a hole in it that you can never fill, no matter how much you love her. What does that do to a family? The 1,990 seconds came and went. Then, the 2000s. Melissa's case was reviewed periodically by cold case units. New detectives would take a fresh look at the file, hoping to spot something their predecessors had missed. They never did. The case remained as baffling in 2005 as it had been in 1971. A woman in a disguise, a fake name, no witnesses, no evidence, no trail. It was the perfect crime. Or so it seemed. Because while the Highmith family was stuck in an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions, the world around them was changing. Technology was advancing in ways no one in 1971 could have imagined. And one of those advancements was about to crack this case wide open. In the early 2000s, something revolutionary started happening. Consumer DNA testing. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com began offering at-home DNA kits that anyone could order online. You'd spit in a tube, mail it back, and a few weeks later, you'd get a breakdown of your ethnic background, your genetic traits, and most importantly, a list of DNA matches. People you were related to. At first, it was just a novelty, a fun way to learn about your heritage, maybe find a distant cousin you didn't know existed. But law enforcement saw something else. They saw a tool. By the mid-2010s, investigators across the country started using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. They'd take DNA from old crime scenes, DNA that had been sitting in evidence lockers for decades, and upload it to public genealogy databases. Then they'd build family trees. They'd trace the DNA matches back through generations, narrowing down suspects until they found the person who'd committed the crime. It was painstaking work. It required expertise in both genetics and genealogy, but it worked. In 2018, the Golden State Killer was caught using this exact method. A man who'd terrorized California for decades, who'd evaded capture for over 40 years, was finally identified because a distant relative had uploaded their DNA to a public database. Suddenly, cases that had been considered unsolvable were being cracked left and right, and the Highmith family was paying attention. By 2020, Alta was in her 70s. Jeffrey was aging too. They'd spent nearly 50 years wondering what happened to their daughter. 50 years of hoping, praying, searching. 50 years of nothing. But now, for the first time since 1971, they had a reason to hope again. Melissa's siblings, her younger brother and sister, decided to take action. They submitted their DNA to multiple genealogy databases, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Melissa had done the same. Or maybe someone related to the kidnapper had. It was a long shot. They knew that. But after 50 years of dead ends, a long shot was better than nothing. So they waited. Months passed, then a year. And then, in late 2021, something incredible happened. A match. Not a distant cousin, not a third or fourth degree relative. A close match. A sibling match. The DNA belonged to a woman living in South Carolina. A woman in her early 50s. A woman who had no idea that the family she'd grown up with wasn't her biological family. A woman named Melissa. When investigators first approached her, she didn't believe them. How could she? She had a mother, a family, a whole life. She had memories of birthday parties and school plays and family vacations. She had a childhood, but the DNA didn't lie, and when investigators started digging into her background, the pieces began to fall into place. The woman who raised her, the woman she'd called Mum, her entire life, had no biological connection to her. There were no adoption records, no legal paperwork, no birth certificate that matched the name she'd been given. It was as if Melissa had simply appeared in this woman's life in 1971, which, of course, she had. Because she'd been stolen. Think about that for a second. Imagine living 51 years of your life, believing you know who you are, where you came from, who your family is, and then one day, a detective shows up at your door and tells you it was all a lie. Everything you thought you knew about yourself, your name, your identity, your entire history was built on a crime. How do you process that? How do you reconcile the love you have for the woman who raised you with the knowledge that she stole you from another family? How do you look at your own children and explain that their grandmother is a kidnapper? Melissa's world didn't just shift, it shattered. But for Alta, Jeffrey, and the rest of the Highmith family, it was the answer they'd been waiting 51 years to hear. Melissa was alive. The reunion was emotional in ways that are almost impossible to describe. Alta, now in her 70s, came face to face with the daughter she'd last seen as a toddler. The little girl with the chubby cheeks and the bright eyes was now a grown woman with children of her own. They embraced. They cried. They tried to find words for something that had no words. 51 years of stolen time. 51 years of missed birthdays, missed milestones, missed moments. You can't get that back. But at least now, they had the truth. And the truth led investigators to the woman who'd taken Melissa all those years ago. The woman who'd posed as Ruth Johnson, the woman in the white gloves and the bonnet, the woman who'd walked into Alta's life, stolen her daughter, and disappeared without a trace. She was still alive, and she'd been living in plain sight the entire time. When police arrested her in 2022, the community was stunned. Neighbors described her as quiet, normal, a little private maybe, but nothing that raised red flags. She'd raised Melissa as her own daughter. She'd never told anyone the truth. Not her friends, not her neighbors, not even Melissa. For 51 years, she'd kept the secret. But now, the secret was out. And the legal system had to figure out what to do with a woman who'd committed a crime half a century ago. Here's the question that haunted everyone involved in this case. Can you ever truly get justice after 51 years? The statute of limitations had long since expired on many of the charges. The evidence from 1971 was sparse at best. Witnesses had died, memories had faded, and then there was Melissa herself. She was the victim, but she was also the woman's daughter, in every way that mattered except biology. She'd been raised by this woman, loved by this woman. How do you punish someone for a crime when the victim has complicated feelings about whether they even want punishment? It's a question without an easy answer. But here's what we do know. The woman who took Melissa didn't do it on impulse. She planned it. She disguised herself. She used a fake name. She targeted a vulnerable single mother and exploited her trust. And then she spent 51 years living a lie. Some people argue that she gave Melissa a good life, that she loved her, that she was, in every meaningful way, her mother. But does that erase the crime? Does that erase the 51 years of agony that Alta and Jeffrey and the rest of the Highmith family endured? Does that erase the fact that Melissa's entire identity was stolen from her? I'll let you decide. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the woman who raised Melissa deserves prison time, or has too much time passed for justice to mean anything? And here's another question. If you were Melissa, how would you feel? Would you be angry at the woman who stole you, or would you be grateful for the life she gave you? Can both things be true at the same time? Because this case isn't just about a kidnapping. It's about identity. It's about family. It's about the lies we tell ourselves and the truths we're forced to confront. And it's about the fact that sometimes the answers we've been searching for our entire lives are hiding in plain sight. We're not done yet. In the final act, we're going to dive into what happened after the arrest, how Melissa is rebuilding her life, how the Highmith family is navigating this new reality, and what this case teaches us about the power of DNA, the resilience of the human spirit, and the fact that some mysteries, no matter how old, can still be solved. But before we get there, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button. Because cases like this, cases that defy logic, that challenge everything we think we know about justice and family and truth. These are the stories we cover here at Cold Case Desk. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. The equation was simple, but the answer was impossible. 51 years of lies, plus one DNA test, equals what, exactly? Justice? Closure? Healing? Or just more questions that no one knows how to answer? Because here's the thing about cold cases that finally get solved after half a century. The resolution doesn't tie everything up in a neat little bow. It doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't give back the stolen years. It just replaces one kind of suffering with another. And for the Highmith family, the hardest part wasn't the 51 years of not knowing. It was figuring out how to live now that they did. When the DNA results came back in late 2021, confirming that the woman in South Carolina was indeed Melissa Highmith, investigators knew they had to move carefully. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a life, a real person with a family, a job, a whole existence built on a foundation that was about to crumble. The lead detective assigned to the case made the call himself. He drove to South Carolina, knocked on Melissa's door, and when she answered, he asked if they could talk. She invited him in, confused but polite. She had no idea why a detective from Texas would be standing in her living room, and then he told her, "We believe you were abducted as a child in 1971. Your real name is Melissa Highmith, and your biological family has been looking for you for 51 years. Imagine hearing those words. Melissa didn't believe him at first. She laughed, actually, thinking it was some kind of mistake. She told him he had the wrong person. She knew who she was. She knew her family. But then he showed her the DNA results. And everything she thought she knew about herself began to unravel. The woman who raised her, the woman Melissa had called Mom, her entire life wasn't her mother at all. She was her kidnapper. Melissa's first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. She kept saying, "That's not possible. That can't be true." But the evidence was undeniable. The DNA matched. The timeline matched. Even the physical description of the toddler who'd been taken from Fort Worth in 1971 matched Melissa's baby photos. The detective gave her time to process. He left his contact information and told her that when she was ready, her biological family wanted to meet her. Melissa sat alone in her house for hours after he left, trying to make sense of it all. She thought about her childhood. The woman who raised her had been loving, attentive, protective, maybe a little too protective. She'd homeschooled Melissa for several years. They'd moved around a lot when Melissa was young, never staying in one place for too long. At the time, Melissa hadn't questioned it. Kids don't. They just accept the world their parents create for them. But now, looking back, the pieces started to fit together in a way that made her stomach turn. The lack of baby photos, the vague answers whenever Melissa asked about her birth, the way her mother always seemed nervous around authority figures. It hadn't been paranoia. It had been guilt. A few days later, Melissa made the call. She reached out to the Highmith family, and in early 2022, they met for the first time in 51 years. The reunion took place at a neutral location, a quiet park in Texas, chosen because it felt less formal than a police station, but more private than a restaurant. Alta arrived first. She was 73 now, her hair gray, her hands trembling as she waited. Jeffrey came too, along with Melissa's younger siblings, the brother and sister she'd never known existed. And then Melissa arrived. Alta saw her walking toward them, and for a moment, time collapsed. She saw the toddler she'd lost, the little girl with the bright eyes and the chubby cheeks. She saw every missed birthday, every missed holiday, every moment she'd dreamed about for 51 years. And then she saw the woman Melissa had become. They embraced, and Alta sobbed. Not the quiet, polite kind of crying, the deep, guttural kind that comes from a place of grief so profound it doesn't have words. Melissa cried too, though her tears were different. They were tears of confusion, of loss, of mourning a life she'd thought was real. They sat together for hours, trying to bridge a gap that 51 years had carved between them. Alta told Melissa about the day she was taken, about the woman in the white gloves, about the decades of searching, the false leads, the sleepless nights. Melissa listened, trying to reconcile this story with the life she'd lived. She told them about her childhood, about the woman who raised her, about the love she'd felt, even if it was built on a lie. And that's where things got complicated, because Melissa didn't hate the woman who took her. She couldn't. That woman had been her mother for 51 years. She'd packed her lunches, tucked her in at night, taught her how to ride a bike. She'd been there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every milestone. Yes, she'd stolen Melissa. Yes, she'd committed an unforgivable crime, but she'd also raised her. And Melissa couldn't just erase that. So now she was stuck in an impossible position, torn between two families, two identities, two versions of the truth. How do you love the woman who kidnapped you? How do you reconcile the fact that the person who gave you life and the person who raised you are two completely different people? It's a question Melissa is still trying to answer. While Melissa was grappling with her new reality, law enforcement was building a case against the woman who took her. Her name, her real name, was finally revealed. For legal reasons, some details remain sealed, but what we do know is this. She was in her 70s when she was arrested in 2022. She'd been living quietly, just a few states away from where she'd taken Melissa all those years ago. When police confronted her, she didn't deny it. She admitted to taking Melissa. She admitted to the disguise, the fake name, the elaborate plan. But she didn't apologize. Instead, she said something that stunned investigators. "I gave her a good life," as if that justified it, as if love could erase a crime. The legal proceedings that followed were complicated. The statute of limitations had expired on many of the charges. Kidnapping laws in 1971 were different than they are today, And the fact that Melissa was alive and had been well cared for complicated the case even further. Prosecutors had to navigate a legal minefield. They had to balance the severity of the crime with the passage of time, the lack of physical evidence, and the victim's complicated feelings about punishment. In the end, the woman was charged with kidnapping and custodial interference. She faced up to 20 years in prison. But here's the question that divided public opinion. Should she go to prison? Some people argued yes, absolutely. She stole a child. She destroyed a family. She lived a lie for 51 years. The fact that she gave Melissa a good life doesn't erase the crime. Others argued that prison serves no purpose at this point. She's in her 70s. Melissa doesn't want her to suffer. And what does justice even look like after half a century? It's a debate that doesn't have a clear answer. But here's what we do know. Alta finally got the answer she'd been searching for. Melissa is alive. She's safe. And after 51 years, they have a chance to build a relationship. It won't be easy. There's too much lost time, too much pain, too many complicated emotions. But it's a chance. And for a family that spent 5 decades with no answers at all, that's everything. Melissa's journey is far from over. She's still processing what it means to have 2 families, 2 identities, 2 lives that somehow have to coexist. She's building a relationship with Alta, Jeffrey, and her siblings. It's slow, it's awkward at times, but it's real. She's also trying to figure out what to do about the woman who raised her, the woman who's now facing prison time. Melissa has said publicly that she doesn't want revenge. She doesn't want to see the woman who raised her suffer. But she also can't ignore the fact that her entire life was built on a lie. So she's doing what anyone in her position would do. She's taking it one day at a time. And she's trying to find peace in a situation that has no easy answers. This case teaches us something important. It teaches us that DNA technology has the power to solve cases that were once considered unsolvable. It teaches us that families should never give up hope, no matter how much time has passed. But it also teaches us that resolution doesn't always mean closure. Sometimes, getting the answers you've been searching for just opens up a whole new set of questions. And sometimes, justice isn't black and white. It's messy, it's complicated, it's human. The Highmith family spent 51 years in the dark. Now they're in the light. And they're learning that the light doesn't make everything easier. It just makes everything clearer. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about this case. Really think about it. Think about Alta, who spent 51 years wondering if her daughter was alive. Think about Melissa, who discovered that her entire identity was a lie. Think about the woman who took her, who committed an unforgivable crime, but also raised a child with love. And then I want you to answer this question in the comments. What would you do if you were Melissa? Would you forgive the woman who raised you? Would you testify against her? Would you try to have a relationship with both families? Or would you choose one over the other? There's no right answer, but I want to hear your thoughts. And while you're down there in the comments, do me a favor. Tell us what case we should cover next. What cold case keeps you up at night? What unsolved mystery do you think deserves more attention? Drop your suggestions below. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you question what justice really means, then hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves true crime as much as you do. Because stories like this matter. They remind us that behind every case file, every police report, every cold case that sits in a drawer for decades, there's a real family, real people, real pain. And sometimes, after 51 years of darkness, the truth finally comes to light. Subscribe to Cold Case Desk so you never miss a story like this. Because we're not just covering crimes, we're covering the human stories behind them. And trust me, there are a lot more stories to tell.